ESG News and Views is the Conference Board ESG Center's podcast channel, providing compelling, in-depth interviews with ESG influencers and timely updates on hot-button environmental, social, and governance topics. Listen in to stay in the loop with current happenings and learn best practices in sustainability, corporate citizenship, and governance.
Hello, this is Paul Washington, Executive Director of the ESG Center here at the Conference Board. The ESG Center focuses on corporate governance, sustainability, and citizenship. I'm really delighted to be joined today by Rebecca Henderson. Rebecca is an author and a university professor at Harvard. There are only 24 university professors. You may think that everyone at Harvard who teaches is a university professor, but it's the highest honor that Harvard awards to an academic. She's also a member of 2 boards of major public corporations, and she's an expert on innovation and change. And she is, perhaps most importantly for today's purposes, she is the author of an upcoming book entitled Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, which comes out on April 28th. I'm really just thrilled that you're here, Rebecca.
Paul, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Great. So let's get underway. So you describe your book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, as a 15-year exploration of why and how we can build a profitable, equitable, and sustainable capitalism. It comes on the heels of a course that you teach at Harvard Business School by a similar name. Can you tell us what inspired you to write this book and to do so now?
Sure. All my students and everyone I met insisted that I write this book. I would tell people that I taught a course called Reimagining Capitalism, and everyone would say, "Oh, I want to read that book." So I thought I'd better write it. I hadn't anticipated when I started that the world would be literally on fire. But with the fires in California and Australia, we're literally on fire right now. So the timing definitely feels right. Got it.
So it's sort of like almost a crowdsourced sort of effort to create this book that you're responding to, right? So, your book is about reimagining capitalism. And by the way, it's a terrific read. And I guess one threshold question that some people might have is, what's wrong with the old capitalism, right? As you note in your book yourself, the case for companies focusing primarily on shareholder value, the traditional approach, is pretty strong. It helps to provide for the efficient allocation of resources. It connects to sort of a sense of individual freedom, right? And, it gives people who work at companies this sense of a clear duty. They know what they're going to do every day. They're trying to make money for their shareholders. And there are also some empirical studies, particularly from the 60s and 70s, that suggested that focusing on shareholder value also could increase societal well-being. But you also say that this approach has failed. While poverty has gone down on a global scale, there really are these urgent economic, environmental, social, and institutional problems that remain. So what, in your view, went wrong with call it the old capitalism?
Let me start by saying I'm a huge fan of free market capitalism. I think it's probably one of the greatest inventions of the human race. When you look at how many people have been brought out of poverty, world GDP has quintupled since I was born. That's incredible. And the population has tripled at the same time. It's amazing what capitalism has done. But I do think we have issues. I do think it needs to be reimagined. Why? Because it's become out of balance with the natural and social worlds on which it relies. So capitalism in the textbook works incredibly well because prices, what we pay for things, reflects their full cost. And that means the magic of supply and demand organizes the economy in a way that no state ever could. But when prices are significantly out of whack, there's no guarantee that free market capitalism will get us where we need to go. The most obvious case of this is failing to take account of the real cost of emitting fossil fuels. If you use electricity generated by burning coal, it costs roughly 5 cents a kilowatt hour. But the health costs of burning coal are at least that much again, And the climate warming costs are probably at least as much again. You can make a case that they're much larger, but I'm being conservative here. These are very generally agreed estimates. The real cost of coal-fired electricity is about 3 times what most people pay for it. And so, in effect, we are making money by throwing greenhouse gas emissions out the window for free, imposing both health and climate change costs on future generations at no cost to ourselves. And so this incredibly productive system is having all kinds of side effects. I focus on climate because it's the easiest to kind of visualize. But the other side effect is we told firms, take wages as low as possible. And, be productive and use as little labor as possible. But if you don't have a solid social base, that runs the risk of inviting firms to say, well, cut taxes. We don't really need education. We don't really need healthcare. We don't need you to raise the minimum wage. All the sort of surrounding infrastructure that keeps labor strong and healthy and a real partner for capital gets destroyed over time. So now we have a world in which the young people are afraid we've basically made a lot of money. We're about to exit, but we've left them a world that's in serious trouble. Plus, a lot of people are feeling that the elites took all the gains for themselves. And I think the best answer to why I think Reimagining Capitalism is a good idea is when I've been talking to about this book to younger audiences, they look at me and say, why reimagine capitalism? Why don't we just throw it out? I think that's a huge mistake. But the surveys tell us, the Edelman Trust survey just out, more than half of the world's population thinks capitalism isn't a system that's working for them. And I'm really worried that the so-called side effects have got loud enough that we're running a risk of losing the whole system, not to mention imposing, untold damage on thousands of lives. So, yes, I think we need to reimagine capitalism.
So that's how the traditional model of capitalism has failed. So in your book, you lay out 5 steps that can be taken as part of reimagining capitalism. Which goes beyond just sort of patching the holes in the old system. So your first step that you mentioned is creating shared value, which sounds wonderful, but what does that really mean?
It's just a long word for a win-win. A company that's creating shared value makes money for its investors, for itself, but it also creates value for its employees, its suppliers, its customers, or the broader community in which it's embedded. It makes money in the sense that it has a fabulous business model. Let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. So take Walmart. Walmart announced a few years ago that they were going to dramatically reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And at the time, people thought it was just a PR stunt. But this is Walmart we're talking about. And so Walmart really focused on this question. And they have, for example, taken $1 billion to the bottom line by simply reworking the way they run their trucking fleet. $1 billion a year. That's a very significant fraction of their total profits. They've also put solar panels on the roofs of many of their stores, and they've really increased energy efficiency in every building they run. And my understanding is that the rate of return on those investments is about 15 to 16%. Wow. No, this is really sort of money lying around on the floor. I think a lot of companies didn't pay much attention to energy because it was 3 or 4% of total costs. And maybe the person you put in charge of your facilities wasn't quite the brightest bulb. But now when you turn and look at it, firms are finding that they can really reduce energy use in very profitable ways. Let me give you another example. Mark Bertolini, the CEO of Aetna, found out that about 8% of his workforce were only being paid minimum wage. And these were people who were answering the phones for his customers, and they were super unhappy. Many of them were working 2 jobs. They were on food stamps and Medicaid. They literally could not afford to buy Aetna's health insurance. And he went back to his team and he said, this is crazy. These are our frontline employees. They are our face to the customer. Let's pay them a bit more. So he raised the wage. He raised it to $15 an hour. Might have been $16, don't quote me, but $15 or $16 an hour. He cut the price of health insurance that they were getting. Some of his employees saw an improvement in their cash compensation of about 30 to 40%. I mean, this really changed people's lives. He had employees breaking into tears. And the other thing it did was improve their engagement and focus on their work and their excitement about being at Aetna. And the other thing it did is get the whole of the rest of Aetna super excited about what Aetna was doing in the world. And Mark was in the middle of a major strategic transformation, which was also about shared value. He was trying to move Aetna as an insurance company from focusing on not paying bills, to minimizing their reimbursement, to really working with his members to improve their health. And again, he thought that was an example of shared value, that if he could stop people going to the emergency room, his costs would go down, his members' health would improve. It was absolutely a win all around. And he sold the company for some enormous amount of money to CVS, but I think partly on the basis of this shared value transformation.
Following through on this notion of projects and things that you can do to actually create value, not just for the company, but for society at large and for other stakeholders like employees and customers.
Well, that's exactly right. And you've said something very important, because the second step I pick up in my book is the importance of having a purpose-driven company. And a purpose-driven company has two important aspects. One is it thinks about its purpose in the world differently. And so for a purpose-driven company, it's not about making money. Not that making money is not important. I sit on the board of 2 big companies. I'm all over real returns to shareholders. But the goal of a purpose-driven company is not money per se. Money is a means to an end. The end is improving the lives of our customers or our employees or changing our community. It's not a crazy way to run a company. Companies were run that way for many, many years. They still are in many parts of the world. But what that does, when you start focusing on a broader goal, is it opens up the opportunity for transformation. Strategically, it helps you see possibilities many other companies don't see. And the second thing it does, if you take it really seriously and you follow through, is it says, okay, we're going to treat our employees with dignity and respect. We're going to empower them to make choices. We're going to adopt what's sometimes called a high road or a high commitment HR model. And again, this is not a new invention. High commitment firms have been around forever. There's been evidence for a long time that if you run that kind of high commitment system, you can see significant improvements in productivity and innovation, enough to pay for the fact that you're a purpose-driven company, so that you are creating a little bit of extra margin around the edges. And I believe that these kinds of firms have the potential to play a catalytic role in reimagining capitalism.
Right, and actually that's a great lead-in, I think, to the third point you make, which is it's about rewiring finance, which I happen to think is probably one of the most critical steps in all of this, because if you're a purpose-driven company, you're also competing for capital and for investors with companies that aren't purpose-driven and may be more financially focused. So our purpose is to deliver sustained and superior returns to our shareholders, says Company A. And Company B, which is more purpose-driven, says, okay, we're trying to accomplish this in society. So you're competing for capital against these, with different types of companies. So what's involved in rewiring finance? It seems like you've got to get your investors and your chief financial officers and everyone else who's involved in finance at a company kind of on board with this.
You surely do. And I think there are 3 important components of rewiring finance. One is that there are some investors who want to invest in more purpose-driven companies for their own sake and say, although they may not mean it, that they're willing to accept lower returns. And the reason this is important is there's an enormous amount of money about to be transferred to the younger generation. People kick around, 20 trillion. I mean, just enormous amounts of money that's privately held going to these younger family offices. And I mean, I teach at HBS. I can tell you that the young generation really does care about these issues, and so they're really, really pushing. They're saying, I don't want my money in guns, I don't want it in fossil fuel companies. We could talk about whether that's a good idea or not, but that's what they're saying. So they say they really want ESG. So that's step 1. That's clearly not enough to really get us anywhere. Second step, super important. increasing evidence that purpose-driven firms that invest for the long term really are more productive and more innovative. It's a suggestion in the data. My students were asking someone who was suggesting they do this. They said, but hey, there's no backtesting data, historically. And the gentleman in front of the room, who happened to be Hiro Mizuno, who runs the Japanese pension fund, he said, wait. In no other industry do you look back to decide what investments you should make going forward. In fact, you're always looking for new stuff and new ways to make money. So I believe, but cannot prove, that those firms that are looking out and focused on the long term are going to do much better than those that lag back. I think we're on the edge of a fundamental transformation in the nature of our economy, that agriculture, transportation, energy, food, CPG, they're all going to change. They must change. And that firms that are the leading edge of that are going to do better. So I believe that. I think that's a bet. So that's the second reason there's so much interest in ESG. But let me give you the third. The third is because for some investors, these so-called externalities, things like climate change or social unrest or pollution, affect the value of the economy as a whole. I mean, if I'm just me, I don't really care whether my firm addresses climate change or not. And in fact, if they address climate change and it's expensive, I might not want them to do that, right? It's about me. But if you're the Japanese pension fund, you own $1.7 trillion worth of assets. That's 7% of the Japanese economy. That's like 1% of the world's economy. You own everything. Climate change is not an externality. If you have a 50 or 100-year time frame, which many of the pension funds do, which many of the family offices do, a lot of money has that very long time frame. And you have to hold the market. You can't diversify away from this risk. You can't hope it's going to go away. The risk of catastrophic change or even of just slow degradation is a risk to your returns. So one way of thinking about ESG, this is a tiny bit pointy-headed, okay? But I am a professor. One way of thinking about ESG is it's a way for this really big money to say to all the firms in its portfolio, you have to pay attention to these issues. You could imagine, Larry Fink came out and said, if you don't have a plan for addressing carbon emissions, we might vote against your board. If you don't have a good disclosure regime, we might vote against your board. Most of Larry's money is in passive funds. That's not money that can move around. He's stuck with that. And the biggest risk to the long-term returns on those funds, much bigger than a kind of marginal up and down, one company performs better than another, is that we have major social unrest, the migration of hundreds of millions of people threatening the stability of global supply chains, the collapse of agriculture in Africa. These are massive risks to the value of his portfolio. So that's another way to think about ESG. Now, how you do it? Slowly. It's going to take time. Like, how do we really rewire finance? Just rewire finance. So let's remember that it took at least 50 years to develop modern, ordinary finance, modern, ordinary accounting. Financial accounts were fought for and fought over for years. In the 1920s, Procter & Gamble's annual report said, our revenue was 29 million and our net profits were 340,000 or whatever the numbers were. Stockholders who are interested in further details may apply in Cincinnati in person. So we forget how long it took to get modern financial accounts. I think the way to think about ESG is it's the next generation in accounting. That there are material factors that affect the performance of the firm that investors are going to want to know. And I think some of the savviest investors have already picked up on this, that, everyone's been looking at financial accounting for 100 years. There's no information in it. Everybody's optimized. But really understanding how firms are running their operations, understanding what kind of risks they're running, understanding how they pay their people, there's gold in their numbers. And so if we could get that replicable, auditable, standardized, those would be very valuable numbers to have. So I don't think this is a pipe dream. I don't think it's going to happen in 6 months, but I'm sure it's going to happen.
Yeah, though it is challenging because you've got to assign a value to both the benefits and the costs that are societal and aren't just traditionally financial, don't you?
No. I think, there are a number of people trying to measure the social impact of these kinds of moves, and I wish them every good fortune, but that's not what I'm talking about. Absolutely not. I'm talking about measuring the material impact on firms themselves.
Got it.
Because in the end, it's only if it has a material impact on firm performance that it will make a difference. I think in the case of some things like carbon, where we can measure the social costs really quite precisely, then investors might push firms for carbon targets that are good for society as a whole. And it might be that we have some crude measures like lowering turnover, raising wages overall might be good, but no, the big prize is what effect does it have on company performance.
Okay, that's helpful, because I think if people are trying to achieve that broader goal, it's of measuring the costs and benefits to society.
Super hard.
That's really hard to do, and I think that sort of daunting prospect may be holding people back.
No, definitely not trying to do that. That's too hard.
Okay, so that's right. That's step number 6, maybe, in what you've got here.
Or 18.
18, right? The advanced class. So another thing you talk about is building cooperation within the private sector and across industries, and I want to hear what's involved in that, because your book also talks about one of the challenges and one of the reasons why capitalism has maybe not performed as well as it should is that incumbent companies have sometimes set the rules in favor of themselves. So how do you get cooperation in the private sector in a way that doesn't sort of favor those who are currently in favorable positions in the private sector?
So you put this very politely, Paul, but business cooperation historically has often been about improving the position of business, and in particular has been about keeping smaller firms out of the industry. So big firms get together, set rules that small firms have trouble meeting, that keeps them out. The rules are selectively enforced to further keep out small firms. Another way of putting this is when I first got really interested in cooperation among firms as a way of building a more sustainable society, I got to have lunch with one of the leading historians of business self-regulation, which is what it's called. And I said to him, I thought, business cooperation could be one of the critical steps to saving the world. And he looked at me and he giggled. He just laughed. And then he gave me all his stuff to read. So I understand this is a long shot, but let's always remember we're facing a desperate situation. We have real problems that it's very unclear how we're going to solve them. So why might business cooperation make sense? It's because there are some problems that are socially important that are creating significant problems for industries as a whole or regions as a whole. So let me give you an example. Unilever decided they wanted to use sustainable palm oil because their brand was under very significant pressure. Activists were showing signs of dying orangutans and blasted heath and children not being able to breathe. And so they were like, okay, we'll stop. Well, the trouble with buying sustainable palm oil is it costs 18-19% more than the dirty stuff. And that's a lot of money when it's just one of your inputs and consumers won't pay more. So I said, okay, we'll get everyone else in the industry to buy sustainable palm oil because everyone else has the same problem with their brand. And if we all do it, no one's at a competitive disadvantage. So that's like the best possible kind of industry cooperation. You saw similar things happening in beef and soy, where the firms were getting all kinds of pressure from activists and consumers. And they said, okay, we all agree we'll stop doing it. And when that works, it works a treat. And so I think it's actually a very important step forward. You're seeing it increasingly happen at local levels in individual cities, for example, where firms are getting together and going, we need a decent education system. No one will move here unless we fix education. And so you get firms cooperating to really build a region that is a place where people want to locate and talent wants to come and employees are comfortable. So absolutely you have to keep an eye on it. If we had more time, you'd ask me about antitrust and all kinds of issues. They're absolutely out there. But, this 5 steps to changing the world business, may I point out that each of these steps is super hard, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. Humans are very good at solving problems. We have a huge problem to solve. So yes, we're going to have antitrust lawyers in the room. They do that. I mean, all of these cooperative organizations, yes, ideally we're going to have government oversight to make sure they're not anti-competitive. Absolutely. But I think a lot of our problems are pre-competitive, and if we could get the firms to agree to all behave well, we'd fix them. And that would be done.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's get to the fifth step, which is rebuilding institutions and fixing governance, because there's a lot that you talk about that the private sector can do, and even when you talk about fixing governance, you talk about the private sector's role in doing that. But some of the challenges, because they are global, you say you need to have government on board, and how does the private sector do that? And I think people are sometimes a little suspicious about business becoming more engaged with government, and business is sometimes a little hesitant because, well, it's sometimes easy for a business to take a stand on a particular issue. Okay, we won't discriminate, or we won't support a government that discriminates in this area. Or it might be fine for business to take a stand that, overall we ought to invest more in job training or in infrastructure instead of the broader issues. It's really hard for business sometimes to take a stand on an issue that may kind of go against their near-term economic interest of that particular firm or that particular industry. There's sort of that middle level of area where businesses have a hard time looking beyond their interests. So what's the role of the private sector here in engaging with government?
So I think business actually has a huge role to play in engaging government. And I know how unpopular an idea this is. People on the left don't want more business engagement with government. They say we have quite enough. That sounds like corruption to me. People on the right say that sounds as though you're asking business to take on a mandate that they don't have information for and aren't equipped for and will do badly. And, we'll get all kinds of bad stuff happening. So it's one of the few issues that right and left completely united on. But nevertheless, I think it's really important. Why? I think it's important because private sector action alone is not going to address the enormous problems we face. And so many of these big public problems can only be solved through government action. Climate change is a case in point. Business can take down its emissions 30-40% and make money, but beyond that, it's going to be super tough. Even with the price of renewable energy falling so fast, we still have a lot of places in the world where building dirty is cheaper. And we still have a lot of fully depreciated plants that are running because it's a fully depreciated plant. And unless and until we pay the full price for carbon emissions, that's going to be profitable to do. Similarly with social issues, I think individual firms can make a big difference. They can persuade people that you can treat people well and still make money. They can spread awareness. But in the end, the only way we know to solve these really big public goods problems is through government and civil society. And the only kind of government that we know that does that well is a democratic, transparent, inclusive society, fully supported by a free press, by a strong civil society, and this won't be that popular with many of your listeners, but some kind of voice for organized labor. I'm British. I'm no fan of old-style unions, but I think some way for employees to group together and negotiate, all the data and the history we have suggests that makes for a more balanced and more healthy society. So that's like a big deal. Mm-hmm. And we could say to business, well, you just wait until that happens. But I think that's a huge mistake, because it's not at all clear to me that it's going to happen. One of the reasons it may not happen is there are segments of the business community that are busy flooding political processes with money designed to prevent this happening. And so one of the reasons I think it's important for business to get involved is I think there are parts of the business community that can see how destructive this is, that can see that we have an arms race going on where, unlimited money to politicians mean politicians have an unlimited chance to ask you for money back, which is not a good thing. And that the whole thing is getting corrupted. One of the few public policies that everyone in the US in this divided time agrees on is get the money out of politics. There is just too much in. Even if the Supreme Court is right and it isn't corrupting what's really going on, it sure as heck looks as though it's corrupting what's going on. I have a few acquaintances who are billionaires, and I tell you, they have conversations I don't get to have.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, they can be left, right, or in between. that there's something wrong with the democratic process that is this out of balance. And so, yes, I think business should get involved. And the way I put it, or try and put it...
But should be involved through its voice and not through its money.
Exactly. That's where I was going.
Okay.
Should be involved through its voice and not through its money. And should be pushing for civics, not for policy. Mm-hmm. Civics is such an old-fashioned word, but what business should be talking about is the process. So everybody should be able to vote. It should be easy. It should be clear. We shouldn't have gerrymandering. Every vote should count. We should get money out of politics. We should have, and now I'm getting a little bit technical, but we should have ranked choice voting. Mm-hmm. It's one of the mechanisms that would really reduce partisanship. We should have a business commit to the health of our democracy as a whole. And I think one of the things that's happened is many business people have, put their head down and concentrated on running their firms, which is hard enough. I really understand that. I sit in a boardroom. But they sort of said, someone else will take care of the democracy, someone else will take care of business. It's increasingly clear that that's not going to happen. It's so hard to be sort of realistic without being alarmist, mm-hmm. right? But I think there is a risk our system will fracture. That in the current environment, we may tip away into populism, either left populism or right populism. And I have no trouble with populists. People saying like, this system isn't working for me, I need it to change. I think that's fabulous. The people I have trouble with are populist governments because they so often degenerate into autocracy or authoritarianism, either left or right. As soon as you say we need one person to express the will of the people, whether it's left or right, now we've lost the democracy and now we're really on a bad road.
Right. So free markets go hand in hand with free governments, basically, or inclusive markets go hand in hand with inclusive governments. And it's up to business to help stand for both. But it seems to me that this requires something that you mentioned in your book, but this all requires courage. It takes courage to do the 5 things that you've said. It takes courage because not everything, as you just pointed out, not everything you're talking about is an immediate win-win. Some things will require companies to sacrifice some of their own benefits to a broader societal benefit, and it's all a bit uncertain, right, as to whether this is going to work and what the ultimate returns are. So it takes a measure of courage on the part of the business community here. What do you think about that?
It's why I talk so much about purpose. I've come to believe that if we only focus on making money and the bottom line, we will rationally destroy the planet and our society. And that what purpose gives you is the courage to take risks, the courage to imagine there's a different way to do things, the courage to stand up for our children in the long term. And that at root, we need a fundamental switch in how we think about what we're about. And absolutely that will take courage.
And let me end with this final question. So your book has this undercurrent of optimism about it. Now, you're British, so it's tempered by reserve, which I respect and understand. But what gives you that sense of hope? Is it because you think as human beings we're wired to want to have a sense of purpose and act on it? But is that what gives you the sense of some degree of optimism here, or does it come from something else?
So let's be careful. I'm not optimistic. I am hopeful.
Got it.
Optimism is, it's going to be fine. I don't think there's any guarantee at all that we're going to be fine. I think I'm going to be fine, but I worry a lot about my children and my children's children and people in less developed parts of the world. The reason I am hopeful is threefold. First, nearly everyone I talk to knows something is badly wrong and is looking for an answer and wants to do something differently. And secondly, this is eminently fixable. The human race is unbelievably rich, very innovative, and enormously hardworking. We have the technologies and the resources to address both our social and economic problems. I have absolutely no doubt of that. So that makes me hopeful. Mm-hmm. And the third is It's no fun to live your life in the midst of despair. It really isn't. What makes me hopeful is I talk every day to entrepreneurs and business people and business students who are coming up with the most amazing inventions and ideas and saying, I'm going to use blockchain to ensure that tuna is sustainably fished. And I'm going to totally revolutionize how agriculture happens. And I've already raised $1 billion and here's the business model. And it's so much more fun to be hopeful. It's so much more exciting. And I think it might work. And what's the alternative? Sit home?
Yeah, it seems so. It's a combination. Maybe it's that they know something's wrong. You believe it can be fixed. People want to make a difference. And frankly, it's more fun.
So much
to do
fun.
that instead of just sit in a state
and having said that, given I'm in the conference board, let me say what I say to all my students. Remember, you cannot crash the company. The best purpose-driven leaders are the best managers. They have to be absolutely on top of every number and the business model while they're trying to make a difference in the world.
Right. Purpose is no excuse for underperformance.
Absolutely. Don't even imagine that you get away just talking about fluffy kittens. Not in my class and definitely not in the world.
And not on this podcast. Well, look, this has been a great conversation, Rebecca. Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening today. Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, a terrific book, is available for pre-order on Amazon and will be out on April 28th. And if you enjoyed today's episode, I'd encourage you to watch our recent webcast exploring the Business Roundtable Statement on the Purpose of a Corporation at conference-board.org. You can also find additional podcasts, webcasts, and blogs on all things relating to sustainability, corporate governance, and corporate citizenship by visiting ESG News and Views at conference-board.org/blog/podcast. Thank you again for listening, and thank you so much, Rebecca.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
This has been ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.